BRICS is the first serious challenge to the Western-led financial order since the end of World War II. But what is BRICS really? And how does it compare to NATO? What would happen if the two organizations were to come to blows? First, it's important to understand that BRICS is not a military alliance. Rather, it's an economic partnership that was initially established to seek out investment opportunities for its members in less developed areas of the world. At least that's the official, sanitized story. The truth is, BRICS was created to directly challenge the Western economic order and try to wrestle the world away from the American dollar. As the global reserve currency, the dollar gives the United States significant geopolitical and economic power, and the currency has underpinned international trade since the Second World War. Ironically enough, BRICS got its start in the middle of America's financial heart, New York City. In 2006, foreign ministers from Brazil, Russia, India, and China, hence the name BRICS, met on the sidelines of a general debate at the UN Assembly. These early meetings laid out the framework for a new global investment bank to rival the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This new bank, known as the New Development Bank or just BRICS Bank, would promote infrastructure development and economic growth, especially in developing economies, and help limit the influence of Western financial institutions. This was immediately appealing to members like China and Russia, who were all too aware of the massive economic pressure that could be leveled against them by the current global order. The crippling sanctions levied upon Russia in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine are proof of how badly BRICS needed an alternative model, and China is now concerned with similar economic warfare in case of a conflict in the Pacific. With a massive need for infrastructure development among its member nations, the BRICS Bank has a major focus on infrastructure projects. It also emphasizes sustainable development, funding projects that are economically viable, and according to BRICS Bank itself, environmentally and socially responsible. One can judge just how true this is by inspecting Chinese construction as part of its Belt and Road initiative around the world. A dam built by Chinese firms in Ecuador began exhibiting serious defects even before being finished in 2016. 2 years later, 7,648 cracks had been identified in the generator hall and adjoining infrastructure. It's estimated that it would require a significant rebuilding effort that's simply out of Ecuador's reach to fix the dam. But that's not the only problem, because while BRICS Bank claims to be interested in environmental responsibility, the dam caused regressive erosion upstream and massive erosion from the released water downstream, leading to the destruction of the San Rafael Falls and the ongoing destruction of San Luis. What did China get for building a dam that's increasingly dangerous to operate, destroying significant portions of the environment, and Ecuador can't afford to fix? 80% of all oil Ecuador produces and $125 million in interest payments by the time the original $1.7 billion loan matures in 15 years. But Ecuador isn't the only example of shoddy Chinese construction. From Pakistan to Africa, shoddy workmanship has become a hallmark of many Chinese mega-projects. BRICS Bank was initially financed with $100 billion in capital, with China providing the lion's share of capital. This prompted China to push for greater managerial power over the bank, and for it to be located on Chinese soil. This pales in comparison with the over $1 trillion in capital that the IMF holds for investments. However, BRICS Bank is often far more attractive to a very special type of clientele, the type who does not appreciate money being loaned with Western caveats attached. IMF loans typically come with significant pressure on the recipients, which includes respect for human rights, more equitable economic development, and environmental and social awareness. Some customers don't appreciate the pressure that can result from accepting Western money, and this is where BRICS Bank comes in, because member nations don't care as much about your human rights record as they care about you becoming an economically viable trading partner. In 2009, BRICS called for a new global reserve currency. The organization did not specifically call out the US dollar, but it was pretty clear that this was their target. The announcement was met with approval from many nations who have historically felt the burn of Western sanctions, or who wish to pursue a global currency more favorable to themselves. This new reserve currency would have to be, quote, diverse, stable, and predictable, which is ironic, because that's exactly why the world has used the dollar as a global reserve currency for nearly a century now. Yet no nation could decide on which currency would be the new global reserve currency, with each nation naturally wishing it to be their own. To date, BRICS has failed to achieve the goal of a unified currency. BRICS would soon add South Africa to the mix, hence the adoption of the S at the end of its name. Further expansion would come in 2024 with 6 new members: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. However, upon the election of Javier Milei in Argentina, he withdrew Argentina's application. Today, BRICS encompasses 30% of the world's land surface and makes up a whopping 45% of the global population. The organization makes up 27% of the world's GDP, with a combined GDP of $28 trillion, or $5 trillion more than the US's GDP at $23 trillion. However, with NATO's GDP being just over $50 trillion, BRICS has a ways to go. The massive share of the global population initially created a real fear that BRICS would not just rival the IMF and World Bank, but actually completely overtake it. And yet, since BRICS was first announced, most of its member states have hit significant roadblocks. China is in the middle of a major economic downturn, and it seems like the economic miracle that pulled the world's most populated nation out of poverty has run out of steam. Starting in the mid-2010s, China's economy showed signs of slowing, with the GDP growth dropping below 8.5% and staying there. As a manufacturing power, China was significantly affected by COVID-19, where its growth shrunk to just 3%. And after a brief rebound, the nation has once more stumbled back down to almost 3%. China's facing serious youth unemployment, growing so bad that since mid-2023, the nation stopped publicly publishing the figure. That lack of information is not just a sign of China's authoritarianism, but a symptom of another facet of China's economic woes. Chinese authoritarianism has historically prevented open reporting that could have averted any number of the nation's current woes, but strict control over the media has made this impossible, and it's hurting foreign investment as well, as nations grow increasingly wary of the Chinese authoritarian model and how it might affect their business operations in the country. Many businesses have long ago stopped moving lucrative high-technology operations to the nation due to rampant industrial espionage, all sponsored by the government in a bid to steal technology and create domestic Chinese copies. China's real estate sector is also in a crisis, with dozens of developers defaulting on their debts. China Evergrande, the nation's largest developer, defaulted on $300 billion in debt and was forced into liquidation, collapsing any remaining consumer confidence in Chinese real estate at home and abroad. The problem is runaway lending and Chinese real estate developers basically enacting a government-sponsored Ponzi scheme. Developers would sell units that hadn't even been built yet to Chinese citizens, and then take those funds to invest in building yet another project, which would be pre-sold as well to a different set of buyers. This model worked perfectly for years, allowing Chinese developers to build at a truly miraculous rate, until suddenly it didn't. To make matters worse, when the Chinese government put lending limits on the nation's banks, real estate developers instead turned to unregulated private investors. In essence, a dream libertarian economy. Like a dream libertarian economy, it all blew up in China's face, with hundreds of billions in investments or bought and paid for apartments and houses that Chinese families will never see again. Russia famously has its own set of problems. After the invasion of Ukraine, the collective West finally got semi-serious about stopping Russian aggression and enacted strict sanctions. Over time, these sanctions intensified, and thousands of Western companies willingly exited the nation, taking tens of billions in investments with them. A price cap on Russian oil has forced the nation to sell at a break-even rate or move to other sellers where it's forced to offer steep discounts, as these buyers now have all the leverage. Even worse, the exit of Western capital and firms means that Russia's energy infrastructure was suddenly left void of billions in investments, and these Western firms took their technology with them, technology that Russia cannot easily reproduce on its own, putting even more strain on the Russian energy sector. We're seeing the culmination of all these effects today as Russian energy infrastructure comes under increasing Ukrainian attack, and the nation is hard-pressed to carry out critically needed repairs. This year, a 6-month prohibition on gasoline has been put in place, purportedly to support Russia's agriculture industry. However, in reality, this ban is probably connected to escalating challenges in exporting and refining gasoline. So far, Russia's managed to stay afloat thanks to the massive foreign reserves the nation had built up before the war. Yet just under half those reserves remain frozen in the West, and the money Russia does have is estimated to run out within the next year and a half or so. Once those reserves dry up, the true impact of the sanctions against the country will be evident, and Russia's Potemkin economy will be revealed for the hollow shell it really is. While the nation won't collapse, it will experience significant economic shrinkage as a result. 2 of BRICS members are experiencing significant economic woes, And that's not the only thing tugging at the Federation. Member states have plenty of issues with each other, making cooperation against NATO unlikely in the extreme. China and Russia may have been trying to appear to cooperate, but significant tensions have been simmering between them since the Cold War. Just this year, Russia refortified military bases near the Chinese border, and for its part, China has made it clear that the no-limits partnership between the two nations had some clear limits. In 2023, Chinese mapmakers began to produce official state maps with Chinese names for territories that China was forced to cede to Russia during the 19th century. Known as the Amur annexation, Russia enforced treaty demands on a weak China, forcing the nation to give up Outer Manchuria to the Russian Empire. This cut off China from the Sea of Japan, and in the 20th century, vast energy reserves were discovered in the territory. There have been concerns in Russia about China making a play for the greater Russian Far East for decades. The region is seeing a significant growth in Chinese immigrants, while ethnic Russians move west, closer to Russia's border with Europe. Russia's collapsing population, both from a mass exodus in the wake of the war in Ukraine and a fall in birth rates, is only intensifying the problem, as is the fact that Chinese investments in the region are outpacing Russian investments. As Russia weakens due to Western sanctions and the war in Ukraine, the nation has been resenting the fact that it's now just the junior power to China. For the entirety of the Cold War and beyond, it was the Soviet Union that was the leading power, a dynamic that China resented. Now China is making moves not just in the RFE, but in Central Asia, a region that Russia has historically seen as within its own sphere of influence. Inviting Central Asian nations into a trade conference, China made it a point not to invite Russia, only fueling further tensions between the two frenemies. While Russia and India have enjoyed warm relations, there is significant growing resentment for India as well amongst Russians. India has taken full advantage of Russia's economic woes, buying up Russian oil at steep discounts, only to turn around and refine it to sell on the international market at a premium. However, Indian and Chinese tensions are also driving India away from Russia. In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many Indian military officials were growing ever more skeptical of the performance of Russian equipment against its Western counterparts. It's not just Russian tanks either, of which India has historically been a major buyer. It's a range of Russian vehicles, like the BMP infantry fighting vehicle. Video after video of American Bradleys dominating Russian BMPs, sometimes even while outnumbered, are contributing to an Indian desire to grow closer to Western arms suppliers. The other factor motivating this increasingly warming relationship with the West is China and its military buildup. As it stands, the Chinese military significantly outclasses India, and Russia is not set up to be able to provide India with the technology needed to balance that equation once more. BRICS' newest members come with plenty of their own drama. Ethiopia and Egypt are currently engaged in a serious dispute over water. A massive dam built on waters that feed 85% of the Nile is set to provide electricity for 60% of Ethiopia's population and could even be exported to neighboring nations. This massive dam has been under construction for over a decade and will revolutionize Ethiopia's economy. But for Egypt, the dam has nearly been a reason to go to war. Egypt relies almost entirely on the Nile for its fresh drinking water and agriculture, and the river also fills Lake Nasser, a reservoir for the Aswan High Dam, which provides electricity across Egypt. Even a tiny drop in the flow of the Nile could be disastrous for Egypt, with a 2% reduction in water flow resulting in the loss of 200,000 acres of farmland. To prevent any potential disruptions, Egypt implored Ethiopia to fill the dam's reservoir across a 12 to 21-year span, but Ethiopia did it in 3 years instead, completely disregarding Egypt's wishes. The fear now is what'll happen when the next drought comes. Egypt's concerned that Ethiopia will opt to fill its own reservoir first to continue generating electricity rather than allow water to flow down the Nile. Then there's Saudi Arabia and Iran, a rivalry for the ages. The two nations are diametrically opposed to one another on nearly every front, and Iran's support for the Houthis, who continue to be a thorn in Saudi Arabia's side, is not helping matters. As Saudi Arabia attempts to transition away from oil in a future inevitably overtaken by renewable energy, the nation's goal of becoming a major international tourism hub is under threat from Houthi violence. In Jeddah, Saudi Arabia has invested nearly $20 billion in creating a trade and tourist hub, but Houthi attacks in the Red Sea have diverted much of global shipping away and directly threaten the viability of tourism along Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast. Iran itself is a pacing threat to Saudi Arabia, with Iranian nuclear ambitions seen as wholly unacceptable to the Saudis. Not only would a nuclear Iran be the ultimate tourism buzzkill, but it would pose a massive risk. Even if nukes are never actually fired, merely the threat of a nuclear attack would be enough to wield significant leverage over Saudi Arabia and the region at large. Though seen as a competitor to the West, many members of BRICS have deep economic ties to Western nations as well. Brazil, for example, is a major trading partner for the US, with the nation exporting over $36 billion to America every year. China exports about 626 billion euros worth of goods to Europe every year. And Egypt is not just a trading partner with the West, but has enjoyed a decades-long defense partnership with the United States. In a war between the two powers, not only would BRICS be outmatched militarily and economically, but many of its members would opt to fight on NATO's side. While China, Iran, and Russia would likely be interested in military cooperation, India, Egypt, and Brazil would all almost certainly opt to join whatever side the US was on. For all intents and purposes, Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States already, with it almost wholly reliant on America for its own protection in exchange for supporting the US regionally, pricing oil in US dollars, and maintaining a stable oil supply. The US is also the largest provider of equipment to Saudi Arabia, and the kingdom relies on American firms to service and maintain its American-made inventory. Ultimately, a war between the two powers is simply not feasible, because NATO is a defensive alliance and BRICS an economic partnership. The interests of its member states make cooperation beyond this almost impossible, as they're often at odds with each other, and the pre-existing relationships with Western powers make conflict extremely unlikely. This leaves the few BRICS members who would have an interest in challenging NATO still fairly isolated and easily outmatched by the combined firepower of the most powerful military alliance in human history. Now go check out World War III hour by hour, or click this other video instead.